So tonight we are starting in Revelation chapter 1 as we start our study of the book of Revelation. And we are using this book that I've mentioned to you. It's called Revelation Unveiled by Tim LaHaye. Tim LaHaye was one of the co-authors of the Left Behind series. Many people know of that book series and have read those books. But this particular commentary is very well written. Tim LaHaye passed away just last year, I think, or maybe earlier this year. And it was a great loss to the Christian community because of his understanding of biblical prophecies and his understanding of the book of Revelation. And so tonight, as we begin this series, as we begin our series of looking at the book of Revelation using Tim LaHaye's book, we're going to go section by section in the book. So if you're looking to fill in the gaps in your notes for next week, look in that section that it's already, titled and everything in your notes, and you should be good to go. You don't have to worry about having your book out as we go through these tonight. I would be more concerned with you having your notes out so you can fill in as we go through this stuff. But tonight what we're looking at is what is called preliminary considerations. And this is just a section in the book at the very beginning, before chapter 1, that basically talks about why it's important to study the book of Revelation. And that's where we're starting at tonight. And we have to be in Revelation chapter 1 to really talk about that. But one of the things that we're going to talk about starting off with is the value of studying Revelation. And in the book, Tim LaHaye gives you 4 different reasons as to why it's important for Christian believers to study the book of Revelation. The Word of God is powerful. The Word of God is impactful in our lives. And if there is a section of it that we don't fully comprehend, if there is a section that we don't fully understand, then it cannot impact our lives as much because of that. So we have to demystify Revelation, and we have to dig in and understand what it says so that it can impact our lives. And it will, when we get through with this study, when you get through working through this book and through this study, your understanding of the book of Revelation will be 10 times greater than it is now. I mean, you'll look back at where you are now and be like, wow, I wish somebody had taught us this sooner. And your understanding of how it impacts other parts of the Bible will also increase. But in his book, he talks about some valuable reasons for studying this great book. And the first one is, he says there's a special blessing that's promised to those who read this book. And we read about that in verse 3 of Revelation chapter 1. And so I've already asked you to turn to Revelation 1, and I know you'll be writing down some answers as we go through tonight, but we're looking at Revelation 1:3 tonight, and it says, and I'll read this to you while you're taking down those notes. It says, "Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near." John basically we're told right here in John's writing in the book of Revelation that the time is near, that the things that are going to occur in the book of Revelation are close at hand. But he says that the ones who read this and hear the words of the prophecy and then keep those words are the ones that will be blessed. And so there is a blessing for us when we study the book of Revelation. There is a blessing in our spiritual life and our understanding and our relationship with God through that. Another value of studying Revelation is that it reveals God's wonderful plan for the future. It reveals God's plan for mankind. Now, you've heard me mention this from the pulpit on Sunday mornings or Sunday nights or Wednesday nights. We've talked about this some. But we know from what the Bible tells us that the very next event in God's calendar for mankind is the rapture of the church. We'll be going into all of this. You'll get explanation on all of that. And let's do this. We're going to go to your notes for the first time. If you look on that timeline that I gave you, it looks like this. If you look on that timeline there, The church age, it says on the left-hand side, is right now. That means basically today, okay? That's everything since the church was founded, when Jesus died on the cross, or when Jesus was on earth doing his earthly ministry. From there until some point in the future when God raptures the church, where God calls out those that are Christians and they are pulled out of this earth and taken to heaven. And so we know that the very next thing in the Christian calendar, so to speak, if you want to call it that, or in God's prophetic calendar, is the rapture. Well, one of the things we read about in the book of Revelation is God tells us this is the next thing on his calendar. And, according to where we are at now in history, we understand that. But after the rapture, there are things that are going to happen that we are going to study about, and we're going to become more clear about it and understand better what God has after the rapture for those that are living. Now, here is the good thing. Okay, you want some really good news about the book of Revelation? Everything after chapter 4 don't have anything to do with you until we get close to 19 and 20 in the chapters. The reason being is, if you're a Christian and you're raptured out of the earth, at that point, all the tribulation, all of the hell on earth that people will experience during the 7 years of the tribulation, you ain't got to worry about. So that's good news for you. Okay, so you can take that home and be like, you know what, after chapter 4, I can sleep in class, so to speak, if you want to. That's sort of the mentality. But after the church is raptured, we're going to be in heaven. And so everything that we read about in the book of Revelation during the tribulation does not apply to us as Christians, because we won't be here. But it ought to light our evangelical or evangelistic fire, because people we know will be. Because if they're not a Christian and the church is raptured tomorrow, they're going to endure those 7 years of tribulation. And so we'll talk about that some more. Another value of studying the book of Revelation is that this book gives clearer detail concerning Bible prophecy than any other book in the Bible. That's kind of ironic, considering most people don't read, much less study the book of Revelation, because it's not clear to them. They don't understand it. It's hard to understand as a book. And so the ironic thing is, it's actually clearer concerning biblical prophecy than any other book in the Bible. And then the fourth value of studying the book of Revelation is this. This book completes the circle of biblical truths. Basically, there are things that happen in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, that are the start, and Revelation is the end point of those things. In your book, there is a list of them. I'd encourage you to read them, because they're encouraging to you as a believer to read those things. But there's things that you read about in the book of Genesis that are basically put in their place in the book of Revelation. And so biblical truths come full circle, so to speak. But there are some suggestions that Tim LaHaye gives for studying the book of Revelation. And I would dare say, outside of the Apostle John, I don't know many people who would know the book of Revelation inside and out like Tim LaHaye did. And so if he gives us some suggestions on how to study the book of Revelation, I would heed his warnings, because he knew what he was talking about. But look, the very first one is to follow the golden rule of interpretation. Okay, that's it. Follow the golden rule of interpretation. And you have in your notes, if I'm not mistaken, what that golden rule of interpretation is. And that's basically, as it says there, when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. If what you're reading makes common sense, don't try and make it more difficult to understand. That's useless. That's making things complicated when it doesn't have to be complicated. Look at what he says there. Take every word at its primary, ordinary, usual, literal meaning, unless the facts of the immediate text clearly show you ought to do otherwise. And so that's the thing, is people start reading in the book of Revelation, and they're like, well, I don't understand this, because all of a sudden you're trying to make it more complicated than it really ought to be. If it says that John is standing before the throne and he sees this in heaven, Well, in John's vision, he is standing before the throne seeing the 24 elders or the 4 beasts or the cherubim or the seraphim or the altar or the throne of God and the rainbow that looks like emerald around God, or whatever the case may be. He sees those things. Don't try and make it complicated by saying, well, John must mean this. No, that's what John saw. That's why John wrote it down. And so don't make it more complicated than it has to be. The second suggestion he has for us is locate the scene of activity. Basically what he's saying is, when you're reading, know where that activity is taking place. Because if you're reading and you don't know if it's in heaven or if you don't know if it's on earth, when you're reading that, you can be very easily confused. And here is a little piece of information that you'll read later in the book that I will go ahead and tell you. When you're reading in the book of Revelation and something happens in heaven, then it has a counterpart happening on earth. Okay, that's something that we have to understand, and you'll see that later as we're going through. When something happens in heaven and a seal is broken, or a trumpet a trumpet judgment is released, or whatever the case may be, or a bowl is poured out in heaven, that has a ramification on earth. And so you have to make sure that you're following where the scene is at, because some things are in heaven and some things are on earth, and it's back and forth. And so you have to sort of follow those things very carefully. The third suggestion he has for us is this. With the exception of chapters 12 and 17, most of Revelation unfolds chronologically. Basically, you could take chapters 12 and 17 out of the book of Revelation, and you could read it basically straight through, and everything happens one after the other. Chapter 12 and 17 are sort of throw a little wrench into those plans if you wanted to try and read it straight through. And that's part of the reason people get confused on it, is because they're reading it straight through, and then you hit chapter 12 and you're like, well, this ain't making any sense. Then you go a little bit further and you're in chapter 17, you're like, this is really not making any more sense. And it's because these two, everything else is basically chronological in time, but 12 and 17 sort of throw a little bit of a hiccup in that. What I would suggest you do is look at in your book, you have image number 1. If you look right behind your notes for tonight, you'll see an image. And I'll try and have these in the book for you every night. But this is what it looks like. You see that? It's got, and what that is basically an outline. It's right after your notes for the preliminary considerations. If you look at that and you start with number 1, you see that the very first thing on the calendar, or the very first thing that we'll be seeing in chapter 4, is the rapture. And then after that, you see numbers 2, 3, 4, all the way through number 31. And this is the order in which things go. Okay, this is a little hard to follow if you haven't studied the book of Revelation before, but you can come back to this as we go through, and you'll see that we'll start talking about the rapture, then we'll talk about these seal judgments. That basically Jesus cracks open the seals. There's 7 seals on this scroll, and as he pops one of those seals off, so to speak, something happens on earth, and it continues to do that until it gets to the trumpet judgments and then to the bowl judgments. That right there between the bowl judgments and the trumpet judgments, it talks about what goes on with the beast. And so it does take a little bit of a detour in chapters 12 and 17. And so that shows you the chronological order of those things. Now, when it comes to interpreting the book of Revelation, there are several ways that you can do that, okay? And I'm going to share with you what Tim LaHaye shares are 4 ways to interpret the book of Revelation. And the first one, the futurist interpretation, is the one that I am teaching you, because it's the one that I believe is correct. Okay, and he's going to you can read it in the book, and he explains to you why this is the way you ought to interpret it, and I agree with him. I realize that others don't agree with this view, and that's okay. Some don't, but there's a lot of people that do. And when it comes to eschatology, that's the study of the end times. When it comes to eschatology and the study of the end times, there are as many views on how to interpret things as there are people. But there are quite a few people that follow Tim LaHaye and the view, or not him, but the same view that he has. This obviously determines the way that you study, but as it says there, the futurist view accepts the book of Revelation as a prophecy that primarily is yet to be fulfilled, meaning that it hasn't been fulfilled completely yet, and particularly from chapter 4 on. See, chapter 1 is the background, is basically John's introduction to the vision or to the revelation of Jesus Christ. Then chapters 2 and 3 are letters to the 7 churches of Asia. And so John is writing up to that point. And then chapter 4 starts off with what is believed to be the rapture. And that's why it's the next thing on the prophetic calendar. That's why everything in the book of Revelation, except for the letters to the churches, everything else is considered to be prophecy that has not yet been fulfilled. And the reason is, as we go through and we study the book of Revelation, I have a feeling that you'll agree with your pastor and you'll agree with Tim LaHaye that the things that we study in the book of Revelation have not yet come to pass. There are glimpses of some of those things that they could have been fulfilled there, but there's so many other things that have not been fulfilled that it all hasn't happened yet. And we'll explain that as we go. The next interpretation is the historical interpretation. And that is the view that John was describing the major events that would take place during the history of the church. That means from John's day until today. And that historical view is that saying that, everything in the book of Revelation has basically, it's history. It's all already happened. Well, no, Jesus hasn't raptured the church. So that's kind of not happened. And there's a lot of other things that we read about the Antichrist, reading about the 144,000 Jewish evangelists. We haven't seen any of this happen yet, so the historical interpretation doesn't really work into interpreting the book of Revelation. The next one is the spiritualizing interpretation. Basically, what that is where people believe everything in the book should be taken figuratively or metaphorically. Basically meaning that you don't take it at its word. You have to look at it and say, this is what John was meaning when he said this. John's talking about a spiritual conflict, not something physically happening on the earth. Well, you know what? When God talks about a third of the population dying, that's not spiritual. That is physical. When he talks about the stars falling from the heavens and the green grass being burned up and the water turning bitter or turning to blood and things like that, that is not spiritual. That is a physical result of something happening in heaven, such as a trumpet judgment or a bowl judgment or something like that. And so there are some things that when we look at it, yes, it does show us that it is a sign, it is a symbol of something happening, such as when we see the woman about to give birth, we understand that that's a reference to Jesus, and we realize that the dragon is Satan, and those are signs and symbols, but those are the things that we take in context as we'll read. And so the final way that one can interpret is the preterist interpretation. And that is that they say that John wrote the book prior to the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and was referring to events in his day. Now, I'm going to mention one thing that will go into your notes next week, and that is that John wrote the book of Revelation around 95 AD. He was a very old man at that point, and he was imprisoned on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea. And so basically he wrote it around 95 AD, but these, with the preterist view, basically say that John wrote it prior to 70 AD when the temple in Jerusalem that King Herod rebuilt, when it was destroyed in 70 AD, they're using that as the marker, saying that John wrote before that, and everything he writes about was fulfilled prior to that. The problem is, John wrote it 25 years later, and none of those things in John's life were fulfilled completely in the book through the book of Revelation. So The preterist view is very difficult to understand as well. But the thing that I want to point you to next is an outline of the book of Revelation, and we're not going to look over this. But in page 2 of your notes, when you flip that page over, you'll see a complete outline of the book of Revelation. It will tell you, it breaks it down for you. That's in your book as well. So if you look at that, it shows you everything. It talks about Christ's message to the churches, and then the tribulation, and John being called up to heaven as signifying the rapture. And then it goes through and it talks about scrolls, and it talks about bowl judgments, and it outlines it all for you here. And so as we go forward through the book of Revelation, all of this will make much more sense than it does right now. And so what I want you to do is I want you to look in your Bibles at Revelation chapter 1, verse 19, and this is where we're going to end up tonight. Revelation 1:19, because this is the key verse that really, as it says there, unlocks the door to the entire outline of the book. This will explain the entire outline of the book and why John wrote what he wrote, so to speak. Because John was told by Christ what to write, and you see it there in your notes and on the screen. But look at verse 19 with me. It says, "Write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after this." And so I'm reading from the New King James Version. It's a different translation as what he's used in his book. But nevertheless, John was told by Christ to write those three things. Write what you've seen in this vision from Christ, this vision that he saw that is recorded in the book of Revelation. Jesus is saying, write what you have seen, write what is taking place right now, and then also write down what will take place later. And so all of those things are what are contained in the book of Revelation. And as it says there in your notes, from all of this, from what Jesus told him to write and what John did write, it seems evident that the book of Revelation is made up primarily of future events. Events that have not happened yet, even in our time. Now, as we look over the next couple of weeks, in a couple of weeks, as we look at the books or the letters that were written to the 7 churches, we will see that those 7 churches each received a letter, and that it was a letter that was meant for those 7 churches in 95 AD when John was writing. But what we will also see is that those letters represent the church of Christ in church history from the time of the apostles until right now. And you'll be amazed at how history relates what happened in church history to what John wrote about in 95 AD. And then 200, 400, 600, 1200, 2,000 years later, John was nailing it right on with what was happening in the church at different times. Here's an easy example, and I can't tell you which letter it was because I don't remember right off the top of my head. But one of the letters that he writes is to a church. One of those 7 churches was a very missional church. It was a church that was very mission-minded. And when you look at the way those letters go through the first chapters 2 and 3, when it gets to that particular church that he's writing to, if you follow the timeline of the church and you apply that letter to a segment of history in the church history, it's the same time, about the 1700s, when people like William Carey in England and others first started the missionary movement that is still going on today. And you look at it and you're like, wait a minute, how in the world would John been able to have written this in 95 AD and then 1700, 1600 years later, nail it spot on that is when the church is starting to send out missionaries to the heathen countries or the heathen nations as they would have called it, and it falls in right in line. But then he also hits the nail on the head with even the time in which we live right now and the way the church is now. And so it's very powerful when you read it and you dissect it and you understand what he's talking about. And that's the hope of this study, is that our understanding of the book of Revelation will increase, and it will impact our understanding of the Bible as a whole, but also so that it will challenge us to be about our Father's business, so to speak, doing what is necessary to share the gospel so that people don't endure the tribulation, so that we do what God has commanded us to do. And so I look forward to sharing with you the book of Revelation, because honestly, it is my favorite book to teach and to study through. And the book that we are using to help us study it is, in my opinion, the best book we could have ever asked for in helping us understand the book of Revelation. And so that's the end of our message for tonight.